Hello everybody, this is my second and final reply to Waldo. We have decided to have a question and answer section of the debate, so after he gives his second and final rebuttal, we will commence with that. I want to make something perfectly clear. There were Jews in Egypt, and we have evidence that at least some of them were slaves. Beginning 4,000 years ago, Semites began crossing the desert from Palestine into Egypt. The tomb of the high priest, boy I'm about to butcher that name, Kohanatap II of the 20th century BCE actually shows an image of Semitic traders bringing offerings to the deceased. Some of these Semites came to Egypt as traders, some as immigrants, others were POWs, and others were sold into slavery by their own people. A papyrus mentions a rich Egyptian ruler whose 77 slaves include 48 of Semitic origin. As a matter of fact, by the late Middle Kingdom era, around 3,700 years ago, Canaanites had achieved absolute power in the form of a line of Canaanite pharaohs ruling the lower kingdoms of Egypt, along with the Egyptian-ruled upper kingdoms. This is evidence, or at least it could be, that perhaps the biblical story of Jacob settling in Egypt could have happened around this time. So long story short, we know the Jews were in Egypt, and we know at least some of them were slaves, and I want to make sure we're being realistic with what we're looking for in the historical records. The way the Egyptians named, called, and spoke about people are what I would call umbrella terms, not very specific, but referring to a large group of people. For example, the Hyksos were a group of people of Semitic and Asian descent who invaded Egypt and settled in the Nile Delta. They formed the 17th and 16th dynasty of Egypt and ruled a large part of the country until driven out. So I hope when looking through historical records, Waldo isn't expecting said records to be super specific or looking for certain specific words. I would also like to draw on the naysayers the fact that the Israelites were greatly influenced by Egyptian culture, such as the Levites, who were members of the group associated with Moses, the Exodus, and the Sinai events depicted in the Bible. In the Torah, Moses is identified as a Levite. Out of all of Israel, only Levites had Egyptian names. Moses, Phinehas, Hophni, and Hur are all Egyptian names, which is what we would expect if Moses is who the Bible said he is and the story of the Exodus is true. I would also like to reiterate and bring up again that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I cannot stress this enough. The Egyptians were no strangers to altering historical records when the truth was embarrassing or went against their interests. It was not the desire of the pharaohs to advertise their failures on temple walls for all to see. When Thutmose III came to power, he tried to wipe out the memory of his predecessor, Hatshepsut. Her inscriptions were erased, her obelisks were built around, and her monuments were forgotten. Her name does not appear in later annals. Also, all records of administration in the East Delta are seemingly entirely gone. So not finding evidence of something doesn't mean you shouldn't believe it. First, Waldo wanted to say we should be able to find a bunch of garbage in the desert. Now he's saying we should be able to find a bunch of crap in the desert. In reality, the absence of evidence in the wilderness proves nothing. A Semitic group in flight wouldn't have left direct evidence. They would not have built cities, built monuments, or done anything but leave footprints in the desert sand. And Richard Elliott Friedman, who holds a PhD from Harvard, is associated with Davis Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia and the Katzen Professor of Jewish Civilization, and associated with University of California, San Diego, and was a visiting fellow at Cambridge and Oxford, and a senior fellow at the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. He is also the author of several books. He says uncovering objects buried 3,200 years ago is a daunting endeavor. An Israelite colleague laughingly told him one time, about a vehicle that had been lost in the 1973 Yom Kippur War that was recently uncovered under 16 meters, that's 52 feet of sand. 52 feet of sand can cover something up in 40 years. Having said that, Waldo, I'm not sure if there even have been an attempt to dig up or look for such things, but if so, my advice is dig deeper. I'd also like to draw attention to the fact that Waldo strawmanned me. I never made the claim that the Jews in the Exodus wouldn't have had a lot to leave behind or that they were very tidy people. I simply brought up it was a possibility. More evidence for the Exodus is a poem found on a papyrus dating to the 13th century BCE, although possibly older, called the Omnipotence of Emperor, or the Lord of All. It tells of a devastated Egypt troubled by plagues, droughts, violent uprisings, resulting in the escape of slaves with Egyptian wealth. In short, this papyrus seems to be telling the story of the Exodus from the point of the view of Egypt, from the river of blood to the devastation of livestock to the darkness. Everything in this poem is mentioned. Then there's the psychological evidence. Why would scribes invent a tale about such a humiliating beginning like slavery? Nobody but the Jews desire or describe the community's beginning in such humble terms. Most people want to connect their leaders to heroic deeds or even claim a direct lineage to gods. The criteria of embarrassment would suggest the story of the Jews being slaves in Egypt is true. We also see in the Bible the conditions of Egypt being described now. Give me a minute. The Bible describes the condition of Egyptian brick making. How would they know the conditions of Egypt or anything like that? How would they know the Egyptians having slaves in the first place, to them knowing what was included in the brick-making process to how such slaves were treated? This certainly goes to support the theory that they know what it was like because they were there themselves and were most likely slaves. Of course, now I'm going to reply to perhaps Waldo's biggest objection against the Exodus, the number. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am not quite sure about the number 600,000 given in the story of the Exodus. What I said in my first argument was just one of two possibilities, the other one being from Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, who is a British biblical scholar, ancient Near Eastern historian, and personal and Brunner Professor Emeritus of Egyptology and honorary research fellow at the School of Archaeology, Classics, and Egyptology. He points out the Hebrew word for thousand, Aleph, can mean different things depending upon the context. It can even denote a group, clan, or leader or chief. Elsewhere in the Bible, Aleph could not possibly mean 1,000. For example, 1 Kings 20:30 mentions a wall falling that in Apkat that killed 27,000 men. If we translate Aleph as leader, the text more sensibly says that 27 officers were killed by the falling wall. By that logic, some scholars propose that the Exodus actually consisted of about 20,000 people. I was also not very convinced in what Waldo had to say about the altar. I feel that in my first argument, I gave more than enough evidence. The altar is in fact the altar of Joshua. Everything from the way that it's built to the remains underneath it and the Egyptian products around it to the place where it is strongly suggested it is the altar. If we use the Bible to find a historical monument, finally get there, we should just be happy with saying we should not just be happy with saying it's one of just any old monument. If Waldo wants to argue that the name Joshua was pulled out of somebody's rear end and attached to the altar and that Joshua never existed, it doesn't really matter. Having said that, this concludes my second argument. Waldo, I await your reply and happily welcome it. It's your turn.